So yeah, that's the first slide. Now let me go back to this. Here we are. Yeah, so my first step is to lay down two ethical principles. And here it's as a precautionary subtitle is these are not normative guidelines, which is a common criticism faced by audiences when presenting this kind of ideas. The first ethical principle is that the idea that we are all equal in an existential sense. That means that the value of my human life experience is existentially equivalent to the human life experience of anyone, anywhere, anytime. I won't go deep into these principles for the sake of time, and but there's another ethical principle very strong in liberation ethics, which poses that the human action creates value when the outcome of that action enables human existence. And here we understand human life, we understand that human lifetime deposited in enabling products, enabling being a synonym of useful products, is another way of defining labor or human labor. So based on those two ethical principles, now we need to make two important distinctions. The first distinction is this classical 19th century, well, it goes back, it goes way before than the 19th century, but let's say this is the classical Marxist distinction between use value and exchange value. And the other important distinction is that one between prices and values. And just to put it very in very general, in a general sense, or to give a general definition, we can say that use value would be those qualitative, unmeasurable features of the products of human action, while exchange value, we could understand it as a quantitative, measurable, and comparable feature of the products of human action. That's an important distinction. And then the other one is the between prices and values. There are many ways to approach this, but again, to simplify the exposition, we can state that prices are the amount of money that determines the exchangeability between different commodities. And that's very different from how we understand values, because for instance, use values they are not exclusively human. They can also be found in nature. But exchange values, they have this feature that they are exclusively defined by the amount of human lifetime deposited in them. Okay, so those are like the axioms or the foundations. But now let's go to something more fun, which is an exemplification or an example, which is partially fiction and partially comes from my empirical data or my field work. And I want to tell you the story of, well, by the way, I have the authorization of these people to use their pictures for academic purposes. So I want to tell you the story of, let's say his name is Jose. That's not his real name, but let's say it's Jose. And Jose is a sort of chieftain or leader in his village. He lives in a village in the Yucatan Peninsula that is located in the southeast of Mexico. He lives in a rural community, a very small one of 300 inhabitants. And he has to go quite often to the capital city of his province, the Quintana Roo state, to do bureaucratic procedures. He's the head of the village and he has to go every now and then to the city. And in his last trip to the capital city, he had some hot dogs in the street, and they were not made out of very good quality sausage. And then he got, well, like stomach infection. And that's why he has been for 2 days now swinging on his hammock all day long. He cannot get up and he cannot work. He's having fever. And the problem that Jose, not Juan, that Jose has is that he's alone in his village in a way, because his wife and children, they migrated to the city of Cancun. That's where they work. But he's quite stubborn, and he wants to keep on being a subsistence peasant. We would define it as that. But so then there's nothing to see, to look after him. But fortunately, next to his house lives, let's say her name is Maria. Maria is Jose's sister, and she knows about medicinal plants. And then she finds out that Jose is in bad shape, and she knows what he's going through. And then she decides to go into the woods. And after 2 hours, she finds some herbal medicinal plants, or some medicinal herbs. She prepares a tea and delivers it to his brother. And the brother gets better. And that's because Maria, she has this old knowledge of traditional healing that has been inherited to her by generations and generations, through many generations. And so then after Jose recovers, he says to Maria, you know what, sister, I really thank you for helping me with this with this wonderful tea. Please take as in exchange, as an indication of my gratitude, 5 kilograms of maize kernels, or dried corn. So she takes those kernels, and well, in a way, that's the end of the story. But then if we look at this very brief episode through an strictly economic lenses, what is going on here is an exchange of values between Jose and Maria. The first thing that we see in this story is that Maria gave to Jose a cup with medicinal tea, and the whole process took her 2 hours of her lifetime to see that her brother was going through a health issue, going into the woods, finding the herbs, preparing the tea, and delivering it to Jose. And then Jose gives to Maria 5 kilograms of maize kernels. So here the question is, okay, we know that the medicinal tea has deposited in it 2 hours of Maria's lifetime. How much time of Jose's lifetime, is deposited or invested in those 5 kilograms of maize kernels? So for that, we need to do some extra calculations. First, we can say, well, what is the use value of those 5 kilograms of corn? Well, they are unmeasurable, they are qualitative, because maize or corn in these areas of Mexico, they have, besides or beyond nutritional values, they have a lot of symbolic values, cultural values, social utilities of many, many kinds. They are almost infinite or incommensurable. But then the exchange value is one, and that can be very concretely calculated or quantified. In this case, the milpa, which is the agricultural system, shifting agricultural technique that Jose is using, and allowed him to obtain 1,150 kilograms of corn, dried corn, but he also obtained, well, many other foods. But let's say that he only obtained 60 kilograms of squash and 60 kilograms of beans. And the sum of all those products is 1,270 kilograms of dried and nutritious biomass. And for that outcome, he invested 300 hours of human lifetime. In this case, and to simplify the story, let's assume that Jose is a very stubborn and traditional peasant that uses no input of a Green Revolution package. He only uses his labor force, his and his family or his friends' labor force, and maybe a match, how do you call it? Like this thing or device to start a fire. So that's all he uses, 30 hours of human lifetime. So the thing is that if we divide 300 hours by 1,270 kilograms, we obtain that every kilogram that he invested 0.24 hours per kilogram, which is equivalent to 14 minutes per kilogram deposited in each kilogram of corn. So the sack of 5 kilograms of maize kernels that he gave to his sister contain around 70 minutes of his lifetime. So then what we see here is that Maria gave 120 minutes of her lifetime deposited in the tea, and she received in exchange 70 minutes from her her brother's lifetime. So what we have here is an imbalanced or an unbalanced exchange, and which is usually the case. Very seldom these transfers will be perfectly equivalent. So another way to see this in a more abstract way, we would see that we have two subjects. Each subject has a different product, and each product has a different exchange value. And there are three moments. The first moment is the moment of production, where the products are created. Then we have a moment of transfer where the products change subjects. And finally, we have a third moment, which is the moment of value balance, which will be different, but also complementary between both. And here the thing is that this is a very simple example to demonstrate what Marx called the law of accumulation, which more or less says that the surpluses or the profits, we could also say the profits from one subject in a transaction will be equivalent to the losses of the other side. In this case, Jose ended up with a surplus or with a profit of 49.13 minutes of human lifetime, while Maria ended up with minus 49 minutes, which in the end, this is all a sum zero game. So in this case, well, Jose didn't do it with the intention of taking advantage over Maria. They are brothers, they love each other. And this is in a way a reciprocity interaction. But so that there's no big potential problems because this is not something that will be repeating systematically. But reciprocity is just one of many different interactions that can take place in different contexts, in different times, and supported by different institutions. Now, we can classify these different types of interaction, or I call it value transfer praxis forms, because there are interactions between at least two different subjects, which would go from one extreme from what anthropologists would denominate or call a pure gift to, and on the other extreme, we would have forced dispossession, which is an unilateral grabbing or taking of value without giving anything in exchange. And in the middle, we have a lot of forms which can be classified in a continuum according to some ontological criteria. But now I want to jump in from this reciprocity example of Maria and Jose to one very specific, also based on empirical data, of one of the most prominent forms of exchange in the modern world, which is the trade value transfer form. And what we have, let me tell you now the story within this same village of charcoal production. Most of the people in this village, they produce charcoal as an activity where they can obtain money from. Milpa is usually for their own consumption, but then they engage in many other activities to obtain some money. And this is like in the situation in this village, the average, these are average values. The first graph we see here is the costs and prices that peasants or charcoal producers have. Here, the story is that the peasant, the cost that he assumes for producing 1 kilogram of charcoal is 3.1. This is in Mexican pesos, but let's just say it's kroner to make it easier. Each kilogram of charcoal costs to every peasant 3.1 kroner. Then they sell in the market to a middleman the charcoal, and they obtain 3.50 kroner per kilogram. So they obtain a very tiny profit of 0.4 kroner. Then the middleman, we see here in the second graph that he bought the charcoal in 3.5, then he sells it in the market at 8 kroner per kilogram, and he added, here we see in the blue bar, 3 kroner per kilogram, and then that implies that he obtained a larger profit compared to the peasant of 1.5 kilogram. And then he goes from the village to the city, and he sells to a small retailer. And the retailer, he has a cost of the raw material of 8 kroner per kilogram. He has additional costs of 4 kroner per kilogram. But then he sells to the final consumers, to his clients in the small retail shop, at 24 kroner per kilogram, obtaining a profit of 12 kroner per kilogram. So there's already, discussions about why profits are organized in this way through value chains. But that's another discussion. Here, what I want to point at is that we are looking at prices, not exchange values, but we can do this analysis, a similar analysis, looking at values, and then we will see different things. So then the first step is to take into account that the charcoal producer, he has inputs which are his labor and other raw materials that he uses, that I won't go into the details of these calculations to make the exposition faster. But what I registered in my fieldwork is that each kilogram of charcoal accounts or is equivalent to 3.71 minutes of the lifetime of a charcoal producer, which is, let me take the laser, this. Each kilogram is equal to 3.71 minutes, and he receives an income of 3.50 kroner per kilogram. So here the question to start analyzing the whole chain is to ask how much lifetime of the middleman is equivalent to those 3.50 kroner per kilogram. But then we have a problem, because the middleman has a different structure of how he uses his time, what's his volume of production, and we have also to consider the price at which he sells to the next actor in the chain. So the analysis goes this way. The middleman, in this case, he's a small guy with a van, and he works 40 hours per week. And with that schedule, or with that time of work, he manages to buy and sell 1 ton or 1,300 kilograms of charcoal. That implies, or that is equivalent to say that 1 hour of the middleman's work allows him to move, on average, 33 kilograms of charcoal, which in turn is equivalent to say that per every kilogram of charcoal, he is investing in each kilogram 1.8 minutes of his time. So then we make some arithmetic transformations to come to the conclusion that the buying price of 350 kroner per kilogram, that is mediating the transaction between the peasant and the middleman, implies for the middleman that he is giving away, or giving in exchange for each kilogram, 0.79 minutes of his lifetime. So then, with these numbers or these calculations, what we can see more clearly is that we have a scenario where the charcoal producer is giving away in every kilogram of charcoal 3.71 minutes of his life that are invested in every kilogram, while the middleman is giving in exchange 79 minutes of his lifetime, which are equivalent to each kilogram he sells to the next actor in the value chain. So here there's again an unbalanced exchange. But the thing is that if we, yeah, and here it keeps the rule that the surpluses of one side will coincide or will be a sum zero situation with the losses of the other side. But then the story doesn't end here, because then, as we saw, the middleman sells to a retailer and the retailer sells to a consumer. And by doing this kind of calculations with each actor in the value chain, we can define what's the whole picture of this give and take of values that takes place at every point in the transactions that constitute the value chain. And just to summarize the analysis of this very particular case, what we see is that the producer here on your right side, the producer lost or gave away or ended up with a loss of minus 2.9 minutes per each kilogram. And the middleman got a surplus when he exchanged with the producer. But on the next step, he lost a lot of value. Here in the table, it indicates that he lost more or less minus 5 minutes per kilogram. And then the retailer, he had a surplus, but he also obtained a surplus when he sold to the consumer, because given the price that was established there, the result or the value balance in that transaction, retailer consumer, implied that the consumer gave away more than what he got in the end. And then, of course, in the end, the sum of all these values, minus 2 plus 21 minus 16, will be a sum zero game, and that keeps complying with the law of accumulation. So, okay, so the idea here is that inside this very simple arithmetic equations, we have a possibility of calculating or having a depiction of how exchange value is moving through value chains. But here it is important to say that more than value chains, we are talking about a networks of very high complexity, which constitute what we usually understand as value chains. And the thing is that in order to make these calculations, well, at some point the numbers or the quantification might become too large, but that should not be an impossible task to do, given that we have already developed for other purposes econometric tools that would allow to make those estimations. And we need essentially, here I'm simplifying a lot, but in essence, we need to know the amount of labor deposited in commodities, the value of the commodities that are flowing or being exchanged in the market, the different sales prices. And another important thing to consider is that all these transactions that are articulating different actors, they have a location, they have a direction, and they are also taking place in different time scales or in defined time scales. Or to put it in other words, if we define a time scale to analyze the flow of exchange values, then we will have different pictures. And this would open the possibility of, in a way, conceiving like a geography of value transfers or these flows of value, which is something that, at least to my understanding, was never tried to, was never attempted by the traditional Marxist scholars approaching surplus value. Here it's more like a geographic approach that could potentially generate like a more comprehensive view of how value is flowing through the global economy. So it's 3:32, and yeah, so then maybe just like a final note to say that well, this is this idea or these arguments, these tools came to me as like the result of my experience working with rural cooperatives in the Yucatan Peninsula, where they wanted to, some cooperatives wanted to see like what was the larger perspective in value chains, and which could be like alternative pathways to move away from a situation that they conceived as already being quite harsh. So yeah, and then later on I presented some of these arguments with scholars back in Mexico, and the feedback that I got 2 or 3 years ago was that well, this was like a line of work that sounded interesting, but economists, well, usually Marxist economists won't want to go in the direction of quantification, and more mainstream economists would not like to mess up with these concepts of use, the distinctions between use and exchange value and so on. So I don't know, I think it's an interesting topic, and I just wanted to share with you to see what are your reactions, or if, yeah, what do you think?
Thanks, Noé. I don't know if you want to record the discussion or only the presentation. I think most people only record the presentation. I think some people feel more comfortable, but it's up to you. Just that people are aware that they'll be recorded.
Okay, well, I would prefer to record the discussion as well.
If everybody's happy, I'm happy with it. I'm just saying in case somebody will, I don't know, feel shy or something. I have one question, but I'll let. Sorry. Yeah, Eric, maybe.
I can break the ice a little bit. Thanks very much, Noé. I really liked the presentation, and I think it's very brave to go into value theories. It's such a labyrinth. We've been struggling with the value problem with thousands of years, and we never solve it, no?
Yeah.
But I think it's entirely worth, it's fascinating and entirely worth studying. I have one reflection and one question. Although it has sort of lost traction in mainstream economics and so on, I still believe that the value has to do with time. To the reach of my knowledge, it was the first to understand it was Ibn Khaldun, the Arab economist of the 14th century, and then it became much more formalized with Marx and Ricardo. No? But I'm interested in the question of to which extent a labor theory of value still holds in digital capitalism, where we seem to be observing a process of decoupling between inputs of labor and time and generation of value. No, like to put an example, I think when Facebook bought WhatsApp, they paid 22 billion. And WhatsApp, I'm making up the number, but it had just a bunch of employees. So it was a massive mismatch between the sort of the economic value and the labor input, no? And it's, I mean, there are different people saying that, yes, this is how value was generated and then the institutional setup of industrial capitalism, but not happening in our time. The Italian guy, Marxist guy, what's his name, has been saying that for a while. Anyway, my question is, do you think this is something, a theory that would be applicable in any part of the world, or only in peasant economies? Or this is something I'm interested and I was quite excited. A few months ago, I came across a paragraph in Marx' Grundrisse called the Fragment on Machines, where Marx predicts a stage of development in the capitalist economy where the level of robotization will be so advanced that you won't be able to explain any longer. Marx himself says you won't be able to explain any, labor theory of value won't explain any longer how value is created in that sort of stage of fully robotized economy and so on. So I don't know if you had any reflections around this, and if you think if in this sort of digital capitalism setup, labor theory of value would still hold or not.
Okay. Well, my approach is I think it's very simple. I will just be repeating what I have read and heard from Enrique Dussel, which is that under this framework or this conception of exchange value as unavoidably linked to human lifetime, then the role of technology is very particular because um, the thing is that technology under this framework allows us to produce more with less human lifetime. So that's in a way to say that technology allows us to produce with less value. And that, well, I find that fascinating because at least in my original education or formal education as a microeconomist in a way, I learned that technology provides added value to things because because it makes our lives easier. But when analyzed in terms of how many hours of lifetime is deposited in things, technology has the opposite effect, that it allows us to produce the same or more with less value. So in theory, with more technology, we should work less and less and less and less. And in that sense, I think it matches with this idea of Marx that you're referring from the Grundrisse. And the other thing that I randomly or spontaneously right now can think of is that this framework also points at like taking always into consideration the mismatches between prices and exchange value, which they always go in different tracks. But what is defining uh, power relations and what is defining how the economy is moving is prices, not really exchange value. So those mismatches, I think they can potentially explain a lot of phenomena linked to inequality and even environmental change. But that's a much more fuzzy argument that I wouldn't dare to elaborate further right now.
Thank you very much. I have more comments and ideas, but I prefer not to take more time for now. But I may come back later.
Another thing is that I think for such a methodology or framework to succeed, it is a must, or is mandatory that it doesn't constrain only to the universe of peasant economy. And what I experienced, at least with these exercises I did with rural cooperatives, was that it was quite straightforward to jump into the next actor in the value chain, because those basic variables, which is the amount of human labor deposited in each commodity, understanding that a commodity can be a product or a service, it's quite straightforward to calculate. The problem is that in our, or as I see it, the problem is that in our national accounting systems, we only register prices. We are not registering the human lifetime that is deposited in different processes. So that's what makes it difficult, but it's every process of production, even if it's highly technified or highly dependent on information technology, has some human component on it. On one extreme, if we have at some point processes of production that no longer imply human labor, then that is the same to say that the outcomes of those processes of production have no value. They should be in theory free. But that's of course a very, very extreme case. But well, at least it fits soundly into this framework. And I think what motivates me is precisely that it allows to jump from peasant economy into other realms the economic system. I see a hand from Arild.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I just wonder, I mean, one thing is the calculations you have done, and I certainly follow the logic of that. There are several comments to whether you can compare 1 hour with another hour in a sense, but I don't want to go down that line, but I want to ask if you have looked at the reasons for these unequal exchanges, assuming that you can compare hours the way you do. Partly it is who have access to technology that can, in a sense, make ownership materialize in unequal exchange, but there are also, I guess, other aspects related to how you are positioned in the chain, power relations somehow. So one thing is to show these figures, but the other thing is to have a discussion about or analysis regarding why does it appear like this. And I wonder if you have been working on that at all, or if your interest is mainly in showing the kind of unequal exchanges.
Well, let's say that my more academic motivation would be in this part of like quantification and the theory, but actually what I invested more time doing before the PhD was discussing with these cooperatives, like how can we explain this unequal distribution of profits when we saw the graphics with the prices and this unequal distribution of profits. And it was a very enriching or fulfilling experience, because what we did was that we exposed these cooperatives to different theories, modernization theory, dependence theory, and other perspectives. And for them to say like, oh, well, this sounds like something more real. This really doesn't explain me that much. And I think it was not so surprising that one of the explanations that was more convincing to them was when we saw like we quantified the amount of units of production in each value chain, or in each step of the value chain. And in the case of we were working with honeybee producers and charcoal producers, what we saw was that it was like a very pronounced pyramid, where at the base you had like all these small farmers distributed around the world, which were like millions, and then the middlemen were less and the retailers were less, and then you reached a point with like the oligarchy of big global retailers, and then the pyramid opens again with millions and millions of consumers dispersed, and we are not organizedly or buying in a collective way. When we go to the supermarket, we do it individually. So that what I'm telling is like the reflection that I recall from these cooperatives, that like this disparity in the way the different actors are organized in the whole value chain it was quite obvious to them that since it's a pyramid, the actors it's a pyramid from below and below and above. And the actors like in the sharpest part of the pyramid are the ones that define the prices and have more of a voice when defining how many profits gets each actor. I don't know if that the explanation is would be convincing in scholarly circuits, but at least that was like the outcome of those reflections with these particular cooperatives of subsistence peasants in southeast of Mexico.
But I think it makes sense, and I think it could also be studied and documented in a way, and try to. I haven't worked on that, but I mean, what you see is a huge difference across the globe concerning how primary producers are organized or not, and how much kind of they can gain power by joining forces. So I think politically, but also scholarly, this is an important element of the topic, even though you might want to concentrate otherwise. Thank you.
No, thanks to you. Darlie has a hand.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting and insightful presentation of ideas of how values chain operates within the production and exchange realm. And I think this is particularly important when it comes to the distribution of the surplus that is produced. And in a way, this works back to the global system, particularly, I mean, within the world system theory and dependency theory, this has been discussed a lot. But within the globalized regime, the neoliberal globalized regime, this is something that is not discussed at all. How, if at all it is discussed, it's at the periphery as kind of side effect of globalization. But this is actually at the heart of globalization and how inequalities are created through the distribution of the surplus produced. And there is particularly from the global south to the global north, how values are accumulated in the global north by exploitation of both resources as natural resources as well as workforce or labor of the working class. So I think this is a very positive contribution to the kind of research we should be engaged in at Noragric. I think even when, particularly within the context of green economy, I think this is very, very important. And how nature is devalued and exploited, like the working class or the labor within the economy. Yeah, thank you so much for this. And I think, Noé, your study of the cooperatives, I think it's a very concrete example of how, if we cut down on the middle level exchanges, then more profits can be accumulated to the, or distributed to the primary producers.
Yeah, I agree, Darlie. And I also, I mean, as far as I recall, like this this tradition of dependency theory and so on, and then what Wallerstein developed afterwards ended up like talking about peripheries and semi-peripheries, and that was like the highest degree of complexity, at least that I recall. But what I see as a potential of like adopting a more like geographic approach on value flows is that, I mean, semi-peripheries would not be the end of the story, because at least as seen from these villages, the product and the transaction is linking them to cities in a peripheric country like Mexico, but then from that city it goes to a port that is of much more importance, and from that port it goes to somebody to another place. And in that sense, it would be like mapping a sort of network of dependencies, or I don't know how to call it, that it's much more complex and dynamic than this image of core peripheries, semi-peripheries, and that's the end of the story. So yeah, I agree with your appreciations. Thank you. Espen, I see your hand also.
Yeah, thank you, Noah. I think this is very interesting. I think I've commented on some of it before. I do find it also interesting that you see this as a way to explain inequality. And of course, it can also be used as a measure of inequality independently, I think. And I think this idea of using it as a measure of inequality potentially also points to, I think, ideas raised by the other people commenting here, that even if you think this helps to explain inequality as perhaps measured by other metrics, it also still leaves something that needs to be explained. That you kind of have to look also behind the numbers that you come up with in an exercise like this. And I think it would be interesting if you took a case, you know, a given value chain or maybe a couple of value chains, and you compared this way of analyzing it with, let's say, more conventional microeconomic ways of analyzing those value chains, and what the differences might be and how to explain them. I'm also curious as to why you use the expression lifetime. You measure it in hours, so how is it different from the simple concept of time, basically?
Well, yeah, I agree that it would be very feasible to take a case and see how far this analysis can go. Also, Darley has been pushing me to go in that direction, and yeah, but the reason I didn't took this, or I didn't take this for my PhD, was that in 2 years ago it was much more fragmented, and I was afraid of getting lost in value discussions, which, as Eric was saying, we've been engaged in those discussions for hundreds of years, and there's still a lot of controversy. But yeah, now I think by now I can see how this could become a more concrete project. And in regards to the difference between human lifetime and ours, I don't think I have a strong answer. I'm just using human lifetime because that's the term that these scholars I'm using as my basis, or as my base, or my foundation. They use that term because it's like it carries also the meaning of that human lifetime also provides use value and not only exchange value. So by taking only hours, we are just looking at like this very abstract and measurable dimension. But I guess that they use it like that because they want to stress out that within this exchange value, there are more things behind. And maybe that's linked to this other thing you were saying, that by quantifying value, you can also correlate it with other dimensions, the environmental dimension, or what's happening with the cultural dimension behind all these transactions that are in a way articulated through global value chains, etc. So yeah, that's what I can say by now. Darley, did you raise your hand?
Yes.
Raise your hand again?
Yeah. I think it's a good way of understanding the relation between human lives and the time, because when you talk of time in abstract terms, it's not connected to something, some real flesh and blood, you know, because when you talk about human lifetime, it's about humans. It's not about some abstract time dimensions as we talk in microeconomics or generally economic theories. And another aspect I wanted to mention is that in the beginning of your presentation, Noé, you set out the basic assumptions, the premise within which your theory has been worked out. And so I think the use of the term human lifetime, a human lifetime was,
human lifetime.
Also relates to the worth of all human lives as equal, irrespective of whatever work you do or whatever quality of work you do. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I I agree. I mean, Adil was mentioning this, posing this question about whether you can compare, but in a way, I'm trying to save myself from that discussion by saying, let's assume that my human experience, which can be measured or not, is equal to is equivalent to the experience, the human life experience of anyone, anywhere, anytime. That's a very it's an ethical principle, and I would say it's not normative in the sense that it's not saying that something is good or bad. It's just an assumption that allows you to elaborate ideas. No, so yeah, Espen, did you raise your hand again? You're mute.
Maybe just a comment to yeah, again, this human lifetime concept that I think I was curious because it seems to me that in your examples you measure it exactly the same way a microeconomist would measure labor to calculate wages, for example. So the difference lies in the expression you use, or is there actually a difference in some other examples that you could give us?
I'm not sure, but what I think now is that how to measure the hours would be putting human life experience in the domain of exchange value. It's still linked to a human life experience that is much broader than merely hours, but that allows the quantifiability and the exchangeability of those products. So I don't know. It's something I need to think about. Okay, so it's almost 4. So I think we should conclude here, Aida.
Yes. Just one thing, Noé, after you finish, please remember to save the video, because sometimes if you don't wait for it to download, you may lose it, and if you can post it. And yeah, no, it was a great talk. Thanks for being willing to present. And my question was just more about, I mean, I'll just leave it there and you can think about it. Maybe it's interesting. It was more about if your approach or this approach you think could help explain better the differences between cooperative within the regions and how they get a better value of their time or whatever you want to say, or if it helps explain the difference between farmers that are members of a cooperative or not. I mean, how does it, I guess it's a bit of what you said already, how it compares with other evaluation methods, and maybe this is more useful for some certain kinds of them. So